Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Varon.
Part 2. Innocent Delight. Tiz has persuaded her uncle Manolo to take her to the sea, which she has never seen. He has just deposited her near the beach and will meet her again the same evening. Aidan, a young English boy, is on holiday in Brazil, staying in the hotel by this beach. Back in the south of England, Aidan goes on a school biology field trip in the unwilling company of a fellow student called Kirsty. "But where is the sea?" she said out loud, looking questioningly in all directions. "And where am I allowed to go?" She then noticed a narrow path which seemed to lead away from the hotel, and deciding it was probably safe, followed it. As she walked along the track, which threaded its way through the slender trunks of the coconut palms, Tiz became aware of a strange odour she'd never smelt before. What could it be? She wrinkled her nose and breathed in deeply. It smelt good. Breasting a small rise in the ground, a wonderful sight met her gaze. The sea! At last! With eyes wide open and every nerve in her body tense, Tiz stopped in complete astonishment as she stared at the scene before her. She had never imagined that anything could be so wonderful. There was the sea, blue and sparkling. Little waves teased the silvery white sand, and sunlight glittered on the dancing water. To her right, the smart new hotel had its frontage on the edge of the beach. White umbrellas and wooden sun loungers were arranged in an orderly row at the foot of a long terrace. However, it was not the hotel that held Tiz's attention, but the brightly painted wooden boats drawn up on the beach. Near one of these, a young lad was industriously cleaning a fishing net. As if in a dream, Tiz walked slowly across the warm sand and squatted down beside him. "Where does it end?" she inquired.
"What end?" said the fisher boy, looking at her curiously.
"The sea," replied Tiz.
"Oh, it goes on forever," said the boy in the offhand manner of one who has lived by the sea all his life. Looking down, Tiz noticed that the net was dotted with little bits of weed, broken shells, and other strange, unrecognisable objects.
"Shall I help?" she inquired.
"If you like," said the boy, and the two of them began to check the net hole by hole, picking out the rubbish. As the last fold was lifted, Tiz saw something that made her catch her breath. There, nestling in the net, half hidden by the sand, was a large pink and brown shell.
"What's that?" she exclaimed.
"Oh, it's only a shell," said the boy, who by now was feeling quite superior to this little girl from the interior. "Do you want it?"
"Oh, yes, yes," said Tiz in a voice intense with yearning, and picking it carefully out of the net, she cradled it in her hands. It was a beautiful shell, perfect and gently curled, with an intricate pattern of brown and pink swirling lines on its outer edges. At its opening, the pink shaded gently into brown, and there was a row of points that looked as if they were standing guard on the hidden space inside. Entranced, Tiz ran her finger along the shell's side, brushing off the sand.
"If you hold it to your ear," said the boy, "you can hear the sea." Tiz did as she was told, and listened spellbound to the low sighing sound which seemed to come from deep within its heart.
"Can I really have it?" she inquired, concerned lest he'd change his mind.
"Yes," said the fisher boy magnanimously. He had been intending to take it to the shop in the grove to sell to the tourists who stayed in the hotel, since it was a particularly fine shell, and they would have paid a good deal for it. But to his surprise, he found that he felt sorry for this small girl with the large, intense eyes and ragged clothes.
Tiz sat back in the sand, gazing at the sea and the empty beach, while she wriggled her toes in the warm, white sand. "Please," she said, hardly daring to ask, "can I go into the sea?"
"Well, of course you can," he said, jumping up laughing. "The sea belongs to everyone. I thought everybody knew that." This made Tiz feel very ignorant, and she hung her head in shame. "Come with me," the fisher boy cried, springing to his feet. He caught her hand and ran as fast as he could into the tiny waves at the water's edge. The spray rose round them like shining stars, which fell back down again in sparkling droplets. The water was warm, and the beach gently shelving, so they splashed out into the bay until the sea reached their knees. Then he pulled her down into the shallow water, and she sat laughing and amazed with the sea swirling all around her.
Tiz, who had never even sat in a bath full of water, let alone a whole ocean, was entranced at the feel of the sea on her body and the salty taste in her mouth. Shaking the water out of her eyes, the little girl looked at the young fisher boy sitting beside her. Her face was radiant. "Heaven," she breathed.
"It may be heaven for you," exclaimed the lad, jumping up. "But if I don't get home soon to help my dad, I shall get into trouble. Oh, if you want a drink, there's a bottle of water in the boat," he added, and surrounded by a halo of multicoloured spray, he bounded back to the shore.
Tiz lay back on her elbows for a long while in the shallow water, just looking, feeling and listening, while the sea gently moved her to its own secret rhythms. She was trying to fix every detail of the scene and every feeling in her body in her memory forever. After a while, she got up and splashed dreamily back to the shore. She noticed that one or two of the loungers now had people lying on them in the shade made by the white umbrellas, and seeing a patch of shadow by the fisher boy's boat, she drank thirstily from his water bottle, then curled up on the soft, warm sand. Soon the rhythmic splashing of the wavelets on the shore and the plaintive call of the gulls as they tracked to and fro across the blue arc of the sky lulled her to sleep.
Had Tiz looked at the people on the loungers, instead of helping the fisher boy, she would have seen to her astonishment that one was occupied by the same boy who had so avidly read his book in the broken-down car. He was obviously reading another exciting story, since he was concentrating intently while rubbing his head in a preoccupied, agitated manner. Presently the portly man and well-dressed woman, who had been with him on that occasion, came down the steps from the terrace.
"Your Uncle Reese has to go back to Belize on business, Aidan," said the woman, "so he wants us to have lunch at once. Put your book down now, please."
"Let me just finish this paragraph, Mum," pleaded the boy, looking up abstractedly.
"Hurry then," replied his mother, and together she and Reese turned and went back towards the terrace.
"That boy spends too much time reading, Emily," said Reese in an irritated voice, as they walked up the steps together. "He needs to do more, live more, get around a bit. He should be swimming and playing beach games, not sitting down all the time." Emily bit her lip and said nothing. This was a constant theme with her brother-in-law, and it irritated her.
"I'd love to contradict you," she thought, "but then Aidan would miss out on these holidays you pay for. When he reaches 18, she added crossly to herself as she sat down at the table, he'll be able to go where he likes, as he'll have his trust fund. Then you can go abroad on your own, because I shan't be coming with you." Sometimes, indeed, she wondered just why it was that Rhys took them with him at all. It certainly wasn't because he found her company congenial. He made that clear in many subtle ways. "Why do I detest this man so?" she asked herself. "His personality grates on mine, and he's insensitive, I know, but I can't quite put my finger on what really makes me dislike him. I only know," she thought sadly, "that when I'm with him I feel constantly irritable and defensive. If only he would stop criticising Aidan, that would help a bit. Thank goodness he's going away again for a couple of days. Not that he'll tell us what he's done when he comes back. He never does." As if reading her thoughts, Rhys remarked conversationally,
"You only come on my business trips for Aidan's sake, don't you, Emily?" And for a moment he looked as if he really sympathised with her. Any nascent feeling of liking for her brother-in-law died immediately, however, for as soon as the words were out of his mouth, he leered at a girl in a bikini who passed close to their table on her way to the beach, and then ordered a gargantuan lunch that would have fed a poor man for a week. "Only here once," he remarked cheerfully. "Got to make the most of it." Just then she glanced up and saw Aidan ambling up the terrace steps. He put his book down on an empty table behind his chair and sat down, gazing dreamily about him, still lost in the story he'd been reading. Eventually, when the last lick of his dessert had gone, Rhys belched and got up to go. "I may not be back until the day after tomorrow, Emily," he said, "so don't worry about me. But I don't think you do anyway," he added unkindly. Speechless with exasperation, Emily watched him as he walked back into the hotel and was amazed to see him scoop up Aidan's book from the empty table and surreptitiously stuff it into the pocket of his jacket. She half rose to stop him, but then sat down again thoughtfully.
"I suppose he may have a point," she conceded to herself. "Aidan ought to do something other than read all day. He might just as well go on holiday in a library." A few minutes later, Rhys appeared in the car park beside the terrace, and she noticed with surprise that he didn't have his laptop with him, only a suitcase. She was still wondering how he could conduct his business without it when he got into his hired car and drove away. When she had finished her coffee, Emily began to feel tired, so she got up from the table where Aidan was still eating a large bowl of ice cream, saying, "I'm going to my room to lie down for a while, Aidan," and went into the hotel.
After failing to find his book where he thought he had left it, Aidan wandered out to the row of lounges to look for it, but it soon became obvious that it had mysteriously vanished. At a loss for something to do, he changed into his swimming trunks and moodily splashed to and fro in the shallow water of the bay for a while. He then sat down under one of the umbrellas and gazed discontentedly at the view. Frankly, he was getting bored with it. He could see the same wide curving beach, the same blue sparkling water, and the same little boats that he'd looked at yesterday. But what was that beside the nearest boat? It appeared to be a body lying very still. He got up to investigate, and soon found himself looking down at the sleeping form of a small girl, who was lying curled up under the lee of the boat. He noticed that she seemed to be clutching a shell in her hand. However, what caught his attention most was the child's elfin face. Upswept lashes, gently caressed salt-streaked cheeks, and one dark brown tendril of hair rested on her forehead like a curled leaf. She looked tiny and insignificant, a piece of flotsam washed up on the beach, waiting to be taken out again by the next high tide. Aidan also noticed that the sun, which had now moved its position, was shining full on to the little body, and he remembered all those things his mother had told him about sunstroke and sunburn. Well, I can at least cover her face, he thought kindly, and took his handkerchief out of the pocket of his shorts.
For a second or two he hesitated, as this had been especially embroidered for his father by his grandmother. It had his initials A.V., Andrew Vickers, in one corner, and twining round them his grandma had worked 2 little fishes. She had embroidered about 30 of these, and Aidan used them every day, as they gave him a precious feeling of connectedness to the father he could hardly remember. Try as he might, he couldn't even bring his face to mind, but when he put his hand into his pocket and felt the handkerchief, it was almost as if he was there with him.
"What shall I do, Dad?" he mused. "Shall I cover her face, or shall I keep it? What would you do?" And he turned the handkerchief over and over in his hands in indecision. Gradually, he began to feel sure that his father would have covered the child, even if it meant losing something precious. So bending down, he softly laid the hanky over her face to shield it from the sun. Then, as an afterthought, he gently scooped handfuls of sand from the beach, trickling it gently down onto the bare legs until they too were completely covered. Several hours later, Tiz awoke. At first she couldn't understand where she was or why her face and legs were covered up. Reaching up, she removed the handkerchief, sleepily stuffing it into the pocket of her old shirt. Then she cautiously raised her head over the gunwale of the fishing boat. An amazing sight met her startled gaze. There was the sun, sinking into the deep blue water of the bay, and from its base stretched a golden path right across the sea to the water's edge. Still half asleep, she stumbled down the beach. Swirling thoughts tumbled round in her head. Then one caught her attention and wouldn't let go.
"I shall walk on that golden path," she thought. "I can go on and on to where it meets the sun." Flinging her arms out wide, she stepped, mesmerised, into the water. Then she heard something that stopped her. It was the sound of a heavy lorry toiling along a sandy road. Uncle Manolo! He had come to get her. Behind her, home, mother, father, Yara, and all she knew and loved. But before her, a wonderful golden path. Her arms fell limply to her sides. Her shoulders drooped, and a disappointed child stumbled up the beach to the waiting lorry.
Sitting on the terrace, Aidan watched the little figure walk down the beach from the shelter of the boat and stand at the water's edge, gazing out into the bay. He saw her arms raised, but he didn't hear the lorry, and watching from the terrace, an image was burned into his brain that he would remember as long as he lived. The black silhouette of a small girl whose arms fell to her side, bent her head, and walked slowly up the beach into the dark trees.
3 years had passed. Aidan was bored, and in fact he should have been too busy, since he was sitting in a classroom listening to his GCSE botany teacher droning on about creeping buttercups. Botany, however, was not his favourite subject, zoology was, and he already felt he knew every single characteristic of that particular plant, and couldn't see how they would help him to be a better doctor anyway.
"I don't imagine doctors write many prescriptions for buttercups," he said to himself sarcastically. He was jerked out of his reverie, however, when the teacher began explaining that on the field trip the next day they would each need to have a partner. Ordinarily, this would not present a problem to Aidan, as he had a good friend called Jake, with whom he worked on a regular basis. But Jake had bronchitis and hadn't been answering his texts all morning. There was just a chance that he'd be better by tomorrow, although, when Aidan had phoned Jake the previous evening, his mother had answered the telephone and informed him that Jake was grumpy, feverish, and coughing most of the time.
"It's like trying to live with a consumptive cactus," she had said, with a good deal of exasperation tinging her normally cheerful voice. "Do come round tomorrow, Aidan. You could play some computer games together, and that might make him a bit easier to live with. Anyway," she added, "I expect you'll be bringing the course notes. Jake can't afford to miss them if he's going to pass his GCSEs." The chances of Jake getting back in time, Aidan feared, were therefore rather remote, and if he didn't come, then he knew he would have to pair up with one of the girls from the neighbouring girls' comprehensive, with whom they were sharing the field trip.
"She'll be the one nobody wants to be with," he thought crossly. "Skinny, scragged back hair, glasses and zits." He moodily chewed the end of his biro, thinking, not for the first time, what a very thin man his botany teacher was. "He looks rather like an animated spring onion," he said to himself, and smiling wryly at his own wit, he critically inspected the teeth marks on the end of his pen.
The next day, although bright, was cold and windy, and Emily fussed round Aidan, insisting that he take his anorak and deluging him with motherly advice.
"I'm not a child," he thought in exasperation. "I shall soon be 16 and she still treats me like a 4-year-old. But then," he conceded, "I suppose I'm all she's got."
The coach, when it arrived from the girls' school, was only half full, and there were still plenty of empty seats after the boys had boarded, so Aidan was able to sit by himself. The route passed through some lovely scenery, but he missed most of it, as he had his nose in the latest thriller on his e-book reader. He also missed the opportunity to take a long look at the only girl who, like himself, was sitting on her own. Their destination was Cardogan's Head on the south coast, home to the classic cliff plants the students had to study as part of their field trip. On arrival in the car park at the foot of the head, they all piled out of the coach into a biting east wind that made them shiver and do up their coats. Several of the bolder girls tried to shelter behind the boys, and there was much giggling and milling about. Aidan was glad his mother had insisted he take his anorak, as he alighted from the warmth of the coach and felt the cold air swirl around him. He shivered and forgave her for fussing. A few minutes later, after the teachers had sorted out the chaos, the spring onion came bustling up to him, accompanied by the spare girl.
"This is Kirsty," he said. "She hasn't got a partner, so you two will work together." Aidan regretfully tore himself away from his story, and looking up saw a plump girl wrapped up in a navy anorak, with the hood shading a face that was turning pink with either cold or shyness. "Oh, great," he said to himself. "The blushing school dumpling. Just my luck." And he stuffed a consoling peppermint into his mouth, churlishly omitting to offer one to his new acquaintance.
The two of them then began the long trudge up the narrow winding path to the top of the promontory. As they came up the last steep slope and onto the short grass of the head, a spectacular view met their gaze. There in front was the Isle of Wight and the rough waters of the Solent, and behind them a large tidal basin where the River Set ran out into the sea. Achingly blue sky merged with green, wave-ruffled water, and the wind wrapped them round in a cold embrace that all but carried their breath away.
Kirsty and Aidan, who had been given a large grid by the spring onion to help them in their assignment, wandered aimlessly along, looking for a good place to start. Neither had yet said a word to the other, and the silence was beginning to be embarrassing. "Oh, drat," said Aidan to himself, "this is hopeless." However, out loud he said, "Let's go by this gorse bush. It'll give us some shelter." And so saying, he plumped down on the grass and fitted the grid over a likely-looking patch. Kirsty stood beside him, clipboard in hand and pen poised.
Aidan was aware that behind the gorse bush they were out of the wind and that the sun was quite warm. He could feel its heat on the back of his neck and wished that he could take his coat off. Looking intently at the area he had staked out, he desperately tried to recall what he should be searching for, but his mind was a complete blank, as he hadn't been paying much attention when the spring onion had briefed them. As he stared desperately at the grid, he became aware of a lovely smell. It was sweet and aromatic, with overtones of earth and grass. Then he noticed a patch of small purple flowers in one of the sections, and realised that he could at least identify these particular plants, as his teacher had mentioned several times that they were prolific on the head. Aidan also remembered being amused by its name. He looked closer, blowing a long peppermint breath over the flowers, to the great astonishment of a passing ant that paused under a leaf, trying to identify the strange odour.
"This must be wild thyme," he said to himself. Feeling pleased, he looked up at the girl as she stood beside him and found himself staring into a pretty, intelligent face. Bright blue eyes regarded him speculatively, and her head, now devoid of the enveloping hood, was covered with a thick mop of auburn curls that seemed to grow in the intense sunshine. All thoughts of wild thyme deserted him completely, and he found himself gazing at her as if she had undergone some sort of Cinderella transformation.
"What have you found?" queried Kirsty, after what seemed a very long pause.
"Wild thyme," muttered Aidan, and then, in a fit of honesty and desperation, he added, "But I'm not much good at this. Why don't you do the looking, and I do the writing?"
"OK then," replied Kirsty. So they changed places, and soon Aidan was having a hard job keeping up with the stream of information that Kirsty told him to write down. Long afterwards, Aidan was hard-pressed to recall what they had talked about as they finished their project and ate their sandwiches in the lee of the gorse bush. Equally elusive was the subject of their conversation as they shared the same coach seat on the way back home. All he knew was that he felt at home and comfortable in her company. She was a good listener, and he was quite disappointed when the coach pulled into his school car park and he had to get off.
"Well, that was fun," he said to himself, "but I don't suppose I shall ever see her again." Later on that night, as he stretched out in bed, the thought occurred to him that he hadn't told Kirsty his name. "The wretched spring onion didn't introduce us properly," he remarked crossly. "I know her name, but she doesn't know mine." He then spent a drowsy 5 minutes trying to work out why it mattered. "I don't suppose it does matter much," he murmured eventually, and turning over soon fell fast asleep to dream of wild thyme, auburn hair, and falling in a prickly gorsebush. You have been listening to Tis from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, a safe place only you can hide, trusting the nose to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run. with the